welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Echoes of Hawthorne Hall. I never believed in ghosts until I worked at Hawthorne Hall. It wasn't that I was a skeptic, but rather, I had always dismissed the stories of haunted places as just that, stories. As a freshman at the local university, I was excited to secure a position working the overnight shift at Hawthorne Hall, a massive, old building on campus. The kind of place where the walls seem to breathe, the floors creak with every step, and the hallways echo with the whispers of a past long gone. The building had stood for over a century, and its walls were steeped in history. Unfortunately, a lot of that history was violent and tragic. Hawthorne Hall had been the site of a terrible fire in the late 1800s. The fire had claimed the lives of several residents, and rumors swirled for years afterward about strange occurrences in the building. Students talked about hearing footsteps when no one was there, doors opening on their own, and cold drafts in the dead of summer. But as a busy college student, I dismissed those rumors as nothing more than superstition. It wasn't until I worked my first overnight shift that I started to wonder if maybe there was some truth to those stories. My first night working the front desk at Hawthorne Hall was uneventful, until about 2 a.m. The building had a quiet, eerie stillness to it at night, especially on the upper floors where the dormitories were. Most of the students were away for the summer, and those who remained were either in the library or working late in their rooms. I sat at the front desk, flipping through my phone and occasionally checking the security monitors. The cameras showed empty hallways and the occasional student wandering through. The building was mostly silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just someone coming down the stairs. But then I realized that the footsteps were coming from the hallway directly in front of the desk. I turned to look, expecting to see one of the students or perhaps a late-night staff member. But there was no one there. I checked the security monitors again, but nothing showed on the cameras. I chalked it up to the building's creaky old floors and tried to brush it off. But the unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. A chill had settled in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling, the hum of the HVAC system playing tricks on my mind. But it wasn't long before things got stranger. A few nights later, around 3 a.m., I was walking the halls, making sure all the doors were locked. The building was always quieter than I expected at night, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you feel like you're walking through a tomb. I had gotten used to it by then, but it still unnerved me. As I passed by the grand staircase that led up to the second floor, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a tall, dark shape standing at the top of the stairs. It was almost as if a shadow had detached itself from the wall, its form indistinct but still undeniably present. I froze. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple with an unnatural cold. I stared at it, heart pounding in my chest, but when I blinked, it was gone. No sound, no movement, just an empty staircase. I rushed up the stairs to double-check the area, but everything was normal. The hallway on the second floor was empty, and there were no signs of anyone being there. I went back to the front desk and tried to calm myself, but my hands were shaking. Was it a trick of the light? My mind playing games with me? Or had I just seen something I wasn't supposed to? As the days went by, the incidents became more frequent. I began hearing footsteps at odd hours, especially late at night when the building was empty. Sometimes they were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. Other times, they sounded like running, as if someone was rushing down the hall, but when I checked, there was no one there. One night, I was alone in the building, working the late shift once again. I had just finished checking the security cameras when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the second floor. The odd thing was that the footsteps were echoing through the building, coming closer and closer. I stood up from my desk and listened. They were coming down the hallway, toward the staircase. Slowly at first, then faster, as if someone were in a hurry. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up the stairs. The footsteps continued, louder now, as if whoever was walking was just ahead of me. My heart raced, and every instinct told me to turn back. But I couldn't, not with those footsteps growing nearer. I rounded the corner onto the second floor and froze. The hallway was empty. Not a soul in sight. I felt a cold draft wash over me, and suddenly, I was hit with the distinct scent of something. Old, decay, perhaps, or mildew. The smell was thick in the air, but there was no explanation for it. The building had been recently renovated, and there was no reason for it to smell that way. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the air grew unnaturally still. I shone my flashlight up and down the hallway, but there was nothing. I hurried back to the front desk, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. As soon as I sat back down, I checked the cameras. There was no one there, not a single person in sight. But as I glanced at the security feed, something caught my eye. In the reflection of one of the cameras, I saw a figure standing in the far hallway, faint, translucent, but unmistakable. A tall, shadowy figure with no distinct features. It was standing perfectly still, staring at the camera. My blood ran cold. The final incident occurred a week later, when I was closing up for the night. It had been another quiet shift, but I had gotten used to the unsettling atmosphere of the building. I was finishing up in the back office when I heard something that sent chills down my spine, a low, mournful cry, like someone in pain. I rushed to the front desk, but the hallway was empty. I checked the security feed and noticed something strange. One of the rooms, room 207, was showing an open door. But when I checked the hallway, I knew for certain that the door had been locked. No one should have been in there. I made my way to room 207, my flashlight trembling in my hand. When I reached the door, it was ajar, but the lock was still in place. I pushed it open cautiously. Inside, the room was dark, the air cold. I called out to see if anyone was there, but no one responded. Everything seemed fine, except for one thing. On the floor, in the center of the room, there was an old photograph. It wasn't mine. I picked it up and stared at it. The image was grainy, black and white, but there was no mistaking the man in the photograph. He was dressed in a suit from a bygone era, with a thick mustache and a solemn expression. And standing behind him, barely visible, was a woman, a shadowy figure whose face was obscured by darkness. I turned the photograph over, and written on the back were the words, "They never left." A chill ran through me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but the photograph felt wrong, as though it had been waiting for me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that I wasn't alone in the room. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Only silence. The cry I had heard earlier echoed faintly in my mind. The next morning, I left Hawthorne Hall as quickly as I could, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still watching me. I never went back to work the night shifts after that. The other staff members continued to tell stories of strange events and eerie occurrences, but I never stayed long enough to see more. A few months later, I learned the truth about the building. Hawthorne Hall had once been a home for troubled souls, a place for those who had nowhere else to go. It had been a residence for the destitute, the sick, and the dying. Many had died there under mysterious circumstances, their deaths whispered about for years. But now, the building had become a place for students and staff to pass through, unaware of the spirits still lingering, trapped by the tragedies of the past. And though I tried to forget the incidents that had happened, the image of the photograph, and the whisper of a voice calling out to me, haunt me still. Hawthorne Hall will always be with me. The echoes of its past refuse to fade. Ng, for the next person to make the mistake of letting him in. Story: The Night Shift. Back in 2010, I took a job at a small tech support company in downtown, dealing primarily with VoIP phone systems and remote IT troubleshooting for small businesses. The company wasn't exactly thriving, and by the time I was hired, it was already obvious that they weren't going to be around for long. It wasn't the kind of place anyone expected to make a career out of, but I was just grateful for the paycheck. My role was straightforward: technical support. I spent my days solving connectivity issues, troubleshooting malfunctioning hardware, and fielding phone calls from frustrated customers. The office was small, located in an aging building with dim fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently and a slightly musty odor that always lingered in the air. It was never a place that felt truly alive, and I'd sometimes joke with my colleagues that the building itself had its own history, one that wasn't particularly friendly. The office was split across 3 floors, with each department taking up one. The IT department, where I worked, was tucked away on the 2nd floor, a small section filled with cubicles and a tiny kitchenette. I quickly became accustomed to the eerie silence that filled the space after hours. My shift was 1 p.m. to midnight, but after 6 p.m., it was always just me and the janitors. They'd leave by 8, and after that, I'd be alone. At first, it wasn't so bad. The office was quiet and relatively uneventful, and I kept myself busy with technical issues and occasional reading between calls. But there was something about the building that always gave me an uneasy feeling, especially after hours. It was as if the shadows in the corners of the rooms were always watching, waiting. The building was old, really old, and you could sense the layers of history embedded in its walls. The floors creaked with every step, and sometimes, you could hear a distant echo, even when you were alone. One night, around 9 p.m., the unease I felt every time I worked late finally boiled over. It started with a simple walk to the vending machine on the 1st floor. The building was pretty empty by then, and I'd gotten into the habit of walking around to stretch my legs. The vending machine was near the back of the building, past a row of windows that looked out onto an empty parking lot. Beyond that, there were thick woods, dense, black, and quiet. The path leading into the woods wasn't lit, making the woods feel even more ominous. It had always given me the creeps, but that night, something was different. As I approached the machine, I saw something, or someone, out of the corner of my eye. It was a shadow, moving in the darkness just beyond the glass doors that led out to the parking lot. I froze, watching. The figure was tall, perhaps 6 feet 4 inches, with a slouching posture, as if they were hunched over in an unnatural way. I couldn't make out details, but I could feel their Presence. It was as if the air around me had thickened, suffocating me. I tried to shake off the feeling and quickly grabbed a soda from the machine, but as I bent down to pick it up, I heard a sharp tap. Like something hitting glass. I straightened up, heart racing, and stared out into the dark. There was nothing there. Just the empty parking lot and the woods beyond. I thought about the shadows I'd seen, wondering if it had been some kind of trick of the light. Trying to calm myself, I turned to head back to the stairs when I heard it again, a louder thud, and this time, I wasn't imagining it. It came from the direction of the doors. My skin went cold. I didn't look back, I just ran, feeling a rising panic grip my chest as I dashed up the 2 flights of stairs to the 2nd floor. By the time I got back to my desk, I was out of breath, my hands shaking. I sat down, forcing myself to focus on my work, but something didn't feel right. The sense of being watched, of someone lurking just beyond my line of sight, was overwhelming. I tried to push the thoughts aside, but it didn't work. That feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. At around 9:30 p.m., I glanced up from my screen, and there he was. Outside, standing just beyond the front doors, was a man. Tall, dirty, and ragged-looking. He had his hands cupped around his eyes, peering inside. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't be sure if it was the same figure from earlier, but the unease I felt when I saw him was unmistakable. I immediately ducked down behind my cubicle, praying he wouldn't see me. I tried to calm my breathing, but it was hard. The man outside didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the building. I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the glass doors. After what felt like forever, he suddenly started tugging at the handles, trying to open them. I could hear the soft rattling as he jerked them up and down, the sound echoing through the empty office. My pulse raced, and I thought about what to do. Should I call the police? Should I hide under the desk? I felt so small and vulnerable. I dialed 911, my fingers trembling as I pressed the numbers. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice asked. There's a man outside my office building, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He's trying to break in. I'm alone here. Please, send someone. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but the longer I spoke to her, the more frantic I became. The man outside was now pacing back and forth, his eyes never leaving the building. I could see the flicker of light as he moved, but he didn't seem to notice that I was watching him. He was so close, too close, and it felt like he could hear my every breath. I hung up with the operator and got down on the floor, out of sight. My mind raced. Should I stay on the line? Should I try to escape? The glass door shook violently, and I heard the sound of something heavy hitting it. I gasped. A rock. It hit the glass with a loud bang, shattering it slightly. I crawled out from under my desk, heart thudding in my chest, and peeked over the cubicle wall. The door was cracked, the rock now lying on the floor inside. I could hear sirens approaching, but the man was still out there. I had to stay calm. I had to wait for the police. The sirens grew louder, and then I heard the pounding of footsteps approaching the building. A few seconds later, I heard voices outside, followed by the sound of flashlights moving through the parking lot. The man was gone. The police arrived, and I explained what had happened, shaking with adrenaline. They searched the area, but they couldn't find him. The officer told me they'd be keeping a patrol. Car nearby until I left, just in case. They also said I'd need to file a report for the damage to the door. I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. It was over, but the unsettling feeling in my gut remained. As I finished speaking with the officer, I thought about what had happened. It didn't make sense. Later, as I gave my statement, I wondered aloud if the man had been connected to someone I used to work with, the guy who had been fired a few weeks ago for stealing from the company. He'd known about all the security measures, knew when everyone left, and had access to sensitive information. But even then, it didn't explain the strange behavior of the man outside, or how he'd gotten so close without anyone noticing. I ended up leaving the company a month later. The whole experience had shaken me to my core. I took another job at a credit card machine company with much better security. It felt safer, though I could never fully shake the memory of that night. That was the last time I ever worked alone at night in a building like that. And I hope I never ever meet that man again. Story: The Shadows of Blackridge. In the heart of the American Midwest, nestled between hills that seemed to stretch on forever, lay Blackridge, a small, almost forgotten town where the old and the new mixed in an uneasy dance. The town's population had dwindled over the decades, with many buildings falling into disrepair, their once vibrant facades now cracked and faded. Yet, amidst the decay, there stood one place that never seemed to change, the Blackridge Mill. It had been there for over a century, a towering industrial complex that once powered the town's economy. Now, it stood silent at night, its vast interior just as desolate as the surrounding fields. The mill had long since stopped production, and the owners had sold the land, leaving behind only the skeleton of a once thriving business. Yet, someone had to keep an eye on it. That's where Matt Hargrove came in. Matt was a 28-year-old security guard, recently hired to watch over the mill during the long, lonely nights. He had worked odd jobs before, but this one was different. For starters, it was a night shift. From 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., Matt was responsible for making sure no one broke in, no one vandalized the place, and no one disturbed the ghosts of Blackridge. Or so he thought. The first few nights went by without incident. Matt spent his time walking the halls, checking doors and windows, watching the occasional raccoon or stray dog skitter across the grounds. He had his routine: a few rounds, a cup of coffee, some reading. Sometimes, when the silence became too much, he would turn on the radio and listen to soft country tunes that made the empty hallways feel just a little bit more human. But the mill was old, and its walls held secrets. Stories that Matt had heard from the locals haunted his thoughts on those late nights. There were whispers of strange sounds, shadows that moved when no one was around, and the occasional glimpse of something, or someone, lurking in the dark corners of the mill. Just stories, he told himself. Just local legends. Nothing to be afraid of. Still, the weight of those tales hung over him as he walked the sprawling halls of the factory. The mill was huge, with several levels of catwalks, storage rooms, and machinery that had long since ceased to function. The floors were littered with rusting tools and broken machinery, evidence of a time when the mill had been alive with activity. Now, all that was left was the echo of distant memories and the persistent hum of the wind blowing through cracks in the walls. It was a Wednesday night when Matt first noticed something odd. He had just finished his regular rounds when he found himself standing in the main atrium of the mill. The dim, yellow light flickered overhead, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. Matt rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the fatigue that had begun to settle in. That's when he saw it. A shadow. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a blur in the corner of his vision. But then it moved. Slowly, silently, it crept across the room, passing between the rusting machines and broken walls like a wisp of smoke. Matt's heart began to race. He didn't want to acknowledge what he saw, but he couldn't look away. The shadow was too distinct, too deliberate. It moved with purpose, unlike any flicker he had ever seen before. "Just my eyes playing tricks on me," Matt whispered, his voice breaking the eerie silence. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just his imagination. He took a deep breath and slowly walked toward the darkened corner of the atrium where he had seen the figure. His flashlight cut through the shadows, but when it hit the area where the figure had been, there was nothing. No footprints. No disturbances. Nothing. Matt felt a chill run down his spine as he turned and walked back to the security room, his thoughts racing. He sat down, trying to calm himself, but the image of the moving shadow lingered in his mind. It was impossible. It had to be. The next few nights were uneventful. Matt went through his shifts without incident, though. The feeling of being watched never quite left him. He tried to shake the feeling off, but it clung to him, lurking in the corners of his mind. On the fourth night, however, things took a strange turn. Matt was doing his usual rounds when he noticed something odd. The lights. They began to flicker. It started in one of the far corners of the mill and spread like wildfire. The lights dimmed and then returned to their full intensity, only to fade again moments later. Matt's flashlight quivered in his hand as he made his way toward the source of the problem, a small room at the end of the building that housed the main electrical panel. As he approached, the lights began to flicker even more erratically, casting long shadows across the room. The air felt thicker here, like something was pressing down on him from all sides. Matt's pulse quickened, and a bead of sweat trickled down his forehead. "Okay, just check the panel and get out," he muttered to himself. He reached the door to the electrical room, but it was locked. Odd. The door should have been unlocked. He turned the knob, but it didn't budge. The feeling of unease was now unbearable, and before he could react, the lights went out completely, plunging him into darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment, Matt stood completely still, his breath shallow and quick. His flashlight blinked on again, casting weak beams into the dark. He cursed under his breath as he fumbled to get the light to work, and when he finally managed to get it going again, the room was as still as ever. Then, something caught his eye. Through the small window of the electrical room, Matt could see a figure standing on the far side of the mill. It was tall, slender, cloaked in something dark that blended into the shadows of the night. For a moment, Matt thought it was another security guard, someone else who had snuck in. Or a prankster. But then he saw the figure move, unnaturally fast, across the room. It didn't walk like a person. It seemed to glide, its feet barely touching the ground. Matt's breath caught in his throat. He knew at that moment that this wasn't something he could explain. He ran to the door, but before he could even try to open it, the figure was gone. No footsteps. No sign of movement, just the deafening silence that filled the building. That night, Matt didn't make it through his shift. He ran out of the mill, leaving his post and everything behind. The next morning, he called his supervisor, telling him he wasn't coming back. When asked why, he couldn't explain. He couldn't find the words to describe the terror that had gripped him. The only thing he knew was that he was never setting foot in that mill again. The stories Matt had heard about the mill's haunted past, the rumors of the old workers who had mysteriously disappeared, the strange occurrences that the locals whispered about, they were all true. And now, Matt was just another part of the mill's long, strange history. The Blackridge Mill still stands today, though its purpose has changed. No longer a factory, it now serves as a relic, a symbol of a bygone era. The townspeople rarely speak of it, but if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can hear the faint hum of machinery, or perhaps it's just the wind. But Matt Hargrove never went back. And the shadow of the mill remains, a dark figure that watches from the window, waiting for the next soul brave, or foolish, enough to cross its threshold. Story: The Midnight Watcher. I had always believed that fear was something we conjure up in our minds. A mere suggestion of danger in the corners of our consciousness. My friends would joke that I was impervious to fear, that nothing ever truly bothered me. But there's a thin line between skepticism and facing something that doesn't belong in this world. And that line, that boundary, is something I crossed one cold September night. It was my third semester of university, and I was already feeling the strain of balancing classes and my part-time job. I had landed a gig as a night security guard at an old, imposing building that housed a large Bavarian manufacturing company. The building was enormous, towering with 8 floors, each more labyrinthine than the last. Most people considered the job easy enough. The pay was decent, and aside from the occasional door left ajar or a window not properly shut, it wasn't much work at all. The only catch was that I was required to walk around the entire building twice a night, once at midnight and once at 3 a.m., to ensure nothing had been left open or malfunctioning. For the most part, it was an uneventful routine. The company building, despite being renovated and modernized on the inside, was old. Hundreds of years of history were embedded in the walls, the creaky floors, and the narrow hallways. It was like stepping into another world, a place that had seen decades, even centuries, of change and then, just as quickly, stood frozen in time. But I didn't mind. I liked the solitude. Most nights, I'd start my shift around 11 p.m., study for a few hours at the security desk, and then begin my rounds. It was quiet and serene. No one ever bothered me. And I'd occasionally bump into the janitor on the late shifts. He was a quiet man, older than most of the staff, who had worked in the building for years. He'd often give me little pieces of advice about the building, though his words were cryptic at times. "Don't mind the reset," he told me once, referring to the nightly electrical system reset. "You'll get used to it. Just don't stay too long in the dark corners of this place." I remember thinking it was just the ramblings of an old man. I was young, invincible in my mind. Nothing scared me. It wasn't until that night, September 14, 2018, that I would learn how wrong I was. I had just completed my first round of the building when I sat back down at the desk, tired and trying to stay awake. I was reading some articles for my psychology class when the lights flickered, just for a second, and then went back on. The reset had begun, as it always did, around 3:55 a.m. It was an odd quirk of the building's electrical system, but it was nothing new. I had grown accustomed to it. The janitor had explained that the whole building went dark for a few seconds during the reset, and the lights would flicker on in a strange, systematic way, as if the entire building was waking up. The reset was mostly harmless, but it had a strange effect on the atmosphere. I can't explain it, but every time it happened, I felt a shift in the air. As if the building were breathing again. After holding its breath It was nothing I ever mentioned to anyone, because I didn't want to sound paranoid. That night, however, something felt different. I wasn't alone in the lobby. I could hear the soft thud of footsteps approaching. I turned, expecting to see the janitor, but no one was there. My heart skipped a beat, and for a second, I questioned my own mind. I stood up from the desk and walked towards the corridor, checking all the usual places. I passed the elevator, which was strange, as I'd never heard it moving before. The elevator doors, on the first floor, were slightly open, a single dim light glowing inside. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes people would leave the elevator slightly open, thinking it would be used soon. But then something odd happened. I took a step forward, my shoes clicking on the marble floors, and suddenly, the elevator doors slid shut. I paused. I was sure I had just seen them open. Maybe it was just a malfunction. The elevator lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the entire floor was plunged into complete darkness. I stood there, frozen, not sure what I was feeling, just a strange sense of unease creeping up my spine. I waited. The elevator doors opened again. But this time, something wasn't right. I could hear the sound of movement inside. There was a shadow, a figure, moving in the darkness. I wasn't sure if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. My heart raced in my chest, and I felt the sudden urge to run. But I didn't. I approached the elevator slowly, my breath shallow. I tried to reach out to press the button to call the elevator back down, but before I could, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The elevator began to rise. I stood in silence, my pulse pounding in my ears. My first thought was to call the janitor, but the phone at the desk was too far away. Instead, I stood motionless, my legs shaking. I watched, horrified, as the elevator slowly ascended, the light flickering on and off, and then, it stopped. The second floor. I should have been panicked. I should have been running for help. But for some reason, I couldn't move. I stared at the elevator doors, which opened once again, revealing nothing but blackness. And then, the noise came. It wasn't an elevator malfunction or any ordinary sound I could explain. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. A knock, if you will. Someone, was knocking on the elevator wall. Not from the inside, but from the outside. Something or someone was inside the elevator shaft. Suddenly, the elevator began to descend again. I had no idea how to react. I could feel the hairs on my neck standing on end. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. I watched as the doors opened once again, this time revealing nothing. There was nothing there. No shadow. No figure. Nothing. But I didn't feel any safer. In fact, it felt worse. I hurried back to the front desk, my heart still pounding. I tried to shake the fear off, telling myself it was just an electrical glitch. But when I sat back down, my eyes couldn't help but wander toward the elevator again. And that's when I heard it. Music. Soft, distorted, static-filled music. I had never heard anything like it before. It was faint but clear, coming from somewhere in the building, distant and yet eerily familiar. I wasn't sure where it was coming from, but it seemed to be coming from the kitchen in the canteen. I grabbed my flashlight and walked towards the noise, the beam of light cutting through the darkness like a knife. As I entered the canteen, I froze. The radio was playing. I looked around, bewildered. The radio had been unplugged and switched off earlier in my shift. I had made sure of that. But there it was, playing music on one of the tables where the cooks used to leave it. The same song, playing softly. I walked over to the radio, my hands trembling as I reached down to turn it off. I couldn't breathe. There was no logical explanation. It didn't make sense. That was when I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, the blood draining from my face. But no one was there. I turned off the radio and bolted from the kitchen, running as fast as I could to the exit. I stood outside, gasping for air, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. I tried to convince myself that I was just overworked, that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that place. The janitor had told me not to stay too long in the dark corners of the building. That night, I never returned. The next 2 weeks, I called in sick, telling my boss I couldn't handle the shifts anymore. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I told myself I'd find another job, but in truth, I couldn't bring myself to go back to that building. The unsettling memories lingered like a dark shadow over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the dark corners of the building. I never spoke about it to anyone, except for the janitor. The last time I saw him, he just nodded, as if he already knew what had happened. "You're not the first," he said. And I never went back. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.